Hi, welcome to Stories of Art. My name is Karel Huidekoper and today let's have a look at this mesmerizing painting by Jules Bastien-Lepage of Joan of Arc or Jeanne d'Arc. It's my favorite painting by him and I always make sure to visit it whenever I am in New York, which sadly is not all that often. But today we're going to have a detailed look at this fantastic masterpiece. You know, strangely, Jules Bastien-Lepage is rarely mentioned in art history classes. I mean, he was a highly successful painter who had been praised at the various salons, received medals, honors. He was copied by many during his day, but during the 20th century he became almost completely obscure. Well, that happened to a lot of the artists from his period, but there would be a revival. It started in the late 60s, then 70s and later, and finally now I think he's starting to be seen again as the great artist that he really was. But let's start with a little bit of background. The artist, Jules Bastien-Lepage, was born and raised in the Lorraine region of France and came from a family of farmers of limited means, which is kind of significant to this painting because Joan of Arc came from the same region and was also a child of peasant farmers. But he eventually went to the Académie des Beaux-Arts in Paris and he studied with Alexandre Cabanel, who at the time was one of the most prominent academic painters. Cabanel was very popular and made these highly finished paintings of often popular mythological subjects. Beautiful nudes like this one, for instance. And Bastien-Lepage clearly learned a lot from him, but went his own way when he was also influenced by the more loose brushwork of the Impressionists. For instance, one of his big successes was this portrait of his grandfather, which was a useful thing to enter into the salon because it started a career as a portrait painter. And it shows the highly finished bit of the face, but also the more impressionist background. So he combined the two very successfully. By the way, his studies had been interrupted by the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. Jules Bastien-Lepage served in the army. He was wounded in the chest, but obviously survived. But the war had been a humiliating defeat for France. And in the end they had to give up part of their country. The area of Alsace-Lorraine became part of the newly formed German Empire and would remain part of Germany until 1918. So not only was it a humiliating defeat for France, it meant that the region where Jules Bastien-Lepage had been born was no longer France. And as you remember, in that very same region, Jeanne d'Arc had been born as well. But after the war, Jules Bastien-Lepage went back to Paris. He started working as a painter, and this painting of his grandfather was first exhibited in the Salon of 1874. And it clearly helped set his reputation. So the next year, in 1875, he was established as a portrait painter and painted the portrait of this man, Henri-Alexandre Vallon. And he had just written a biography of Jeanne d'Arc. And apparently it sparked Jules's interest, because shortly after that he started working on this painting and repeatedly asked the advice of Vallon on how to best set his picture. Now the painting is obviously of Jeanne d'Arc, and I kind of assume you've heard of her, but just to be on the safe side, let me tell you a little bit about her. She was the daughter of peasant farmers born around 1412 in Domremy in the Lorraine region. This was during the 100 Years' War between England and France, which by that time had been raging for about 80 years. And when she was about 13 years old, in the year 1425, her town was attacked by English and Burgundian forces. Undoubtedly stuff was broken, people were killed, but what is mostly reported strangely in history is that a lot of cattle was stolen. And shortly after that, little Jeanne started having visions. By the way, Jeanne d'Arc probably never heard herself being called that. I mean, Jeanne d'Arc. The first time the name Jeanne d'Arc was recorded was decades after her death. For instance, during her trial, her father's name was recorded as Jacques Tart, and she herself was referred to as Jeanne de Domremy. And in her letters, I mean, she wrote several letters, but not by hand. She couldn't write herself, so she dictated them. And they were signed Jeanne la Pucelle, or simply La Pucelle, which means the maiden. But we still call her Jeanne d'Arc. And she reported having visions of the Archangel Michael, who was the patron saint of the Lorraine region. But later on, she also said she had visions of Saint Margaret and Saint Catherine. And these visions told her that she had to liberate France from the English. By the way, she never specified which Saint Margaret or which Saint Catherine she had visions of, and the problem is there are more than one Saint Margaret and Saint Catherine, but it's generally assumed that it's Margaret of Antioch, who in the 3rd century was eaten by a dragon and escaped from its belly through prayer, and her cross that had irritated his innards. And Saint Catherine is probably Saint Catherine of Alexandria, the one who was tortured on a wheel with spikes and angels set her free by breaking the wheel, although she was later beheaded, so it didn't help her much. But those two were very popular saints at the time and in that region. But her visions were insistent, and so she set out to meet the king, which was Charles VII, who held court in Chinon, not in Paris, because that was in English hands at the time. And it took a while to convince enough people to get her there. So it was in 1429 when she first met him. And she promised him to lift the siege of Orleans and to lead him to Reims to be coronated, because he hadn't officially been coronated yet, because Reims was the place to do that, and it was in English hands as well. So Charles VII then had her tested in various ways and by a council of theologians, and she was examined by Charles VII's mother-in-law to see if she was really a virgin. This apparently was very important, otherwise she could have been in contact with the devil. But when everything was said and done, she did take part in the relief of the siege of Orleans. She did help to secure Reims so the coronation could take place, and she led the successful campaign across the Lorraine. But after that, her luck ran out. She was part of several unsuccessful sieges, and she tried to set up her own army of volunteers to lift the siege of Compiègne, and there she was captured by Burgundian forces. Now these Burgundian forces were led by the Dukes of Burgundy. In this case that's Philip the Good, who I've mentioned before in many of my videos. He was the man who was the ruler of the Low Countries at the time, who had one of the most sumptuous courts in all of Europe, and who would be the patron of Jan van Eyck, for instance. I mean, Jan van Eyck was at that very same time, say about 1430, working on the Ghent altarpiece. And if you want to know more about that one, I've made a video about that one as well. But Philip the Good had sided with the English, which sounds weird because he came from Burgundy, which is French, and he was a cousin to Charles VII. But he had some good reasons. I mean, Charles VII did have his father murdered. So when the troops of Burgundy captured Joan, she was delivered to the English, who gave her a mock trial in Rouen. She was accused of heresy, following demonic visions, and blasphemy for wearing men's clothes, and was of course famously burnt at the stake. Decades later, the war ended, and a concerted effort was made to rehabilitate her. There was a retrial in the 1450s, and she was eventually exonerated. Now, even though she was a big deal at the time, she was largely forgotten in the following centuries. But in the 19th century, she started to gain popularity again. Her story became part of the story of France and the struggle of its people for freedom. So it became part of this new nationalist feelings that people started to have. Several writers saw in her a revolutionary force, and of course we're all aware of how fond the French were of their revolutions in the 19th century. And so she started to become a symbol of France, more or less. And we noticed that because she was depicted more and more often, and especially after the defeat in the Franco-Prussian War and the loss of the very region she had come from. So very often at the time she was depicted, and usually as a heroine in full armor. But in my opinion, this version of her is the most compelling. This is of course set before her heroic deeds. What we see here is Jeanne in the garden of her parents' house. That house apparently still existed or had been rebuilt or whatever, but it was a tourist site, and Bastien-Lepage visited it, and it apparently reminded him of his own upbringing in very similar circumstances. And what we see here is her having her first big vision. The story, as it was told at the time, was that her visions were of these three saints, that is the Archangel Michael, Saint Margaret and Saint Catherine. And apparently originally Bastien-Lepage had contemplated painting her seated in ecstasy in front of an altar, but then changed his mind to this, I think, much more powerful version where she's in that garden, and we see her looking up, but not looking anywhere but inward. There's this wonderful gaze in the distance and this blush on her cheeks, and it's a spiritual awakening. She's not really looking at anything. Now you might at first think that she's looking at unseen saints in front of her, but she isn't. just look behind her. There we see where she's just been. Jeanne had been sitting on that stool that toppled over while at her spinning wheel. And there she had her vision, because if we look up, we see the Archangel Michael and two women next to him floating in midair. It's not made clear which of the women is which saint, neither one of them has an attribute, but it doesn't really matter. We know the story, so we know that they're the saints Margaret and Catherine. And I love how they are floating there and are somehow not entirely solid. You can see that they are a vision because you can see through parts of them. Some of their garments become sort of wisps of mist or smoke, and you can see the stones of the house behind them peer through. But the most important figure is of course Joan herself, and he made her into a real farm girl. She's standing next to a tree, maybe she's leaning on it, while with one outstretched hand she holds a branch with some leaves, almost as if she reaches out to something unseen and at the same time tries to hold on to something solid and real. And I love that her hands are dirty, and so are her feet, or at least the one that we can see. And then there's that face, those beautiful blue eyes staring up at something but not looking at anything. In a letter to a friend, Bastien-Lepage wrote that her face was the combination of two girls that he had met and sketched. By the way, he corresponded with a number of friends about the composition, so we know that he struggled with it. For instance, one of his friends really objected to the theme of the saints being behind her, because that way she couldn't see them. But actually, that was a tried and tested formula. This, for instance, was a popular depiction of Jeanne d'Arc by Léon Bénouville, where we see the same scene but very differently interpreted. We see Joan interrupted from her chores, she's actually doing some spinning work as well, and she's interrupted by the saints that are behind her. We can see all three of them, and Michael giving her a sword. And there are several others where the same setting was used, like this one by Eugène Thérion, where it's just the archangel speaking in her ear, and some sort of celestial soldier behind him blowing a trumpet. Although there's no evidence that Bastien-Lepage ever saw this one, but we can be absolutely sure that he saw this one by Léon Bénouville. We know this because a copy of it hung in the house of Joan of Arc in Domrémy, which Bastien-Lepage visited. And also it was the frontispiece of the biography of Jeanne d'Arc by Wallon, the man portrayed by Bastien-Lepage that inspired him to paint this picture in the first place. Now, he entered this painting in the Salon of 1880, and it was received with mixed reviews. Many hailed it as exceptional for all the obvious reasons. Bastien-Lepage was a naturalist painter, so people expected certain things from him. For instance, that his pictures would be very realistic, which it obviously is, and lots of detailed attention had been given to all the plants and all the settings, and lots of praise was given for the attitude and the look on the face of Jeanne in the midst of this spiritual event. But at the same time, there were those who heavily criticized him for adding the supernatural in a naturalist painting. That is, they hated the fact that there could be saints floating in the air in a natural setting, which surprises me because that is exactly what makes this such a powerful painting to me. Now, as it turned out, the praise and negative criticism was about evenly distributed. It was about a 50-50 thing, but of course, negative criticism tends to weigh heavier than positive words, and soon after the Salon of 1880, Bastien-Lepage left Paris and he moved to England. Some critics, by the way, were more critical of the French state because they failed to buy the painting when they had the chance. And, as it happens, it was quickly bought by an American businessman named Irwin Davis, which is how it ended up in New York, and you can still see it there today in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So, if you want to see it for real, that's where you have to go. But before you pack your bags, don't forget to like and subscribe. And of course, thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.